Today's study brings us further into the book of 2 Timothy, where we will pick up in chapter 3, verse 1. The overriding theme in both 1st and 2nd Timothy is Paul's encouragement for Timothy to maintain his standing in the true doctrine of Jesus Christ. It's evident that Paul is concerned about Timothy. We would remind you that there's no evidence of anything personally in Timothy's life that would cause Paul concern. So it's not that Paul thinks that Timothy's necessarily weak or vulnerable, more vulnerable than any other preacher or teacher of the gospel. But it seems to be a general concern. A general concern, again, not founded in the character of Timothy, but founded in the character of others who would threaten the doctrine of Jesus Christ. A concern that is founded in the times in which Timothy was living and was going to preach the gospel. And so we might make application by transferring those concerns to ourselves today. Not that we're necessarily weak spiritually, or any more vulnerable than any other Christian or teacher of the gospel. But there's no doubt that we live in what Paul will describe here in chapter 3, that we live in perilous times, and that we may be surrounded by those people that are going to be described here that don't have a respect for the truth of God's Word and for living with integrity and the spiritual mindedness that a servant of God demands. And so let's look at the warning that Paul gives Timothy here in 2 Timothy chapter 3 when he says this, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." These last days are evidently not talking about the last days of life here on this planet, because the conditions of the character of men that he described is something that is present now. And also he says to Timothy, "And from such people turn away." This is a personal admonition to Timothy. And so whatever or whenever these last days are, it must be days in which Timothy was living. Because the last days, these perilous times, would be conditions that Timothy would be faced with. These men that he's going to describe here are going to be people that Timothy would come in contact with and that Timothy needs to turn away from. And so he says in these last days, perilous times will come. These dangerous, difficult times, one translation says terrible times would come. Times that are terrible because of the condition of the hearts of the men described. And so he says these perilous times are again perilous because of the men that live in them. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, and unholy. What a description of these men who would make these times perilous. That these are men that are just consumed with self, not caring about others. They love themselves, they love money, they are boasters, proud, and in their attitude toward others, they are blasphemers. Now, the word blasphemers just means the idea of abusive or revilers. We usually use this term in regard to language and attitudes directed toward God, but it's not limited to that. You may just be talking about those who are reviling or abusive in their language toward others, as well as toward God. They're disobedient to parents, they're unthankful, they're unholy. Paul is not describing men with what we would call redeemable attributes and attributes that a man like Timothy should be drawn to. He goes on to say, verse 3, they're unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good. They are traitors. That is, that they're unforgiving, they're irreconcilable, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. You get to the picture of these people, of these men, as being almost completely inward focused. They don't care about God. They don't care about others. All they care about, their entire focus is on themselves. Now, up until this point, we may think that we're just reading about people of the world, just ungodly men who have nothing to do with God or Christianity. But notice what he says in verse 5. These men, with all of these horrible, selfish, ungodly characteristics, he says they're having a form of godliness, but denying its power. What does he mean when he says they're having a form of godliness? Nothing that we read about up here is godliness in any shape, form, or fashion. And so what does he mean when he says that these men have a form of godliness? Well, it seems that he's talking about men who made the claim, at least, to be Christians, and maybe even made the claim to be preachers of the gospel. And so Paul says they have a form of godliness. They have some kind of an appearance that they are associated with the things of God. But in reality, they are denying its power. They're not sincere. They don't truly have God in their lives or in their hearts. And Paul says, Timothy, from such people turn away. He'd encouraged him in his first letter to Timothy not to quickly attach himself to other people, but to be circumspect and to be wise in his evaluation of those with whom he would attach himself and his reputation. Timothy, not everybody who wears the name Christian is truly a Christian. Not everybody who even is a preacher of the gospel is somebody that you need to be associated with. They may have a form of godliness, but are truly denying its power. What do these men do? For of this sort are those who creep into households and make captives of gullible women. And we don't take this to be meant in necessarily the literal sense that they were breaking into houses and kidnapping women. These terms are terms that are used of metaphorically, spiritually, that these people with this type of attitude, who were in some sense teachers or preachers, they were spiritually entrapping. They were spiritually making captive of these gullible women. Now, Paul is not saying all women are gullible, but the ones who would fall prey to these type of characters are certainly can be described as gullible women. And women who are loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. And so he may be saying that like attracts like, that here are these women who are described in very unflattering terms, just like the men who are described in very unflattering terms. And so these men with these ungodly attitudes can attract these women, these weak women with these ungodly attitudes who are loaded down with sin, led away by various lusts, and always learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. These that seem to be, not because they have some difficulty in learning or comprehending the truth, but maybe because of their sin and their lust, they never really want to come to that full knowledge of the truth. Now, of these men who are making these times perilous, Paul makes a comparison to some Old Testament characters. Now, as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so do these also resist the truth. He's probably referencing a story in the book of Exodus chapter 7. Now, the names Jannes and Jambres aren't found in Exodus chapter 7, but Paul, by inspiration, seems to identify them by name for us here. And he says, these men resisted Moses. Now, Moses was a spokesman for God. Moses was delivering the law of God. But these men, much like these men in the latter days, resisted Moses. So do these, that is, these men also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds, disapproved concerning the faith. So maybe the lesson of this is twofold. Number one is, Timothy, don't be surprised. It's always been that way. You could go all the way back into the old law, in fact, the beginning of that old covenant. And notice how there were men then, men who claimed to be in a covenant relationship with God, claimed to be a part of the people of God, but they resisted the truth then. And so don't be surprised when men will resist the truth today. Don't be gullible yourself in thinking that just because someone claims to wear the name of Christian or claims to be even a preacher of the gospel, that they truly are godly in every sense of the word. And so lesson number one is, don't be surprised. Sadly, it's always been that way. Lesson number two is in verse 9, but they will progress no further. Speaking of these men that were described in verses 2 through 5, they will progress no farther, for their folly will be manifest to all, as theirs also was. So just as Jannes and Jambres were exposed as being rebellious against the truth, so these will be. Timothy, be patient. Don't attach yourself to just everybody who's making a claim. Be wise. Be discerning. Stay away from these type of characters, because they will progress no farther. You keep teaching and preaching and living the truth of the gospel, Timothy. And these false teachers, though they may get a following for a time, there will be a time in which their folly will be manifest to all. Timothy, you preach the truth, and you stay away from everything that is an enemy to the truth. What a lesson for us today. Do some soul searching. Are these characteristics of these men who make for perilous times, can this in any way describe you and your character today? Or are you like Paul encouraged Timothy to be? Do you just want to know the truth, to live the truth of the gospel in your life, and to share it with others who might be able to be teachers themselves?